I begin today's sermon with the same words I ended last week's sermon. These are the words of Teresa of Avila. God has no body on earth but ours, no hands but ours, no feet but ours. Ours are the eyes through which the compassion of Christ looks out to the world. Ours are the feet with which he is to go about doing good. Ours are the hands with which he is to bless others now. There's one sentence that particularly stands out to me this morning as we ponder together today's familiar gospel story, the parable of the Good Samaritan. That sentence that stands out is, "Ours are the eyes through which the compassion of Christ looks out to the world." What does it mean to look upon another with compassion? When I looked up compassion in the dictionary, I found the word has two parts: com, meaning together, and pati, meaning to suffer. Therefore, to have compassion for others means to suffer together with them. Now, we all know we cannot fully know another's suffering, but we can share in his or her suffering. While compassion is often a noun, it is lived out as a verb through our words and our actions. We speak compassionately both with our tone of voice and the words that we say. For example, "I'm so sorry that that happened to you." We speak compassionately with our body language and our facial expressions. We speak compassionately through acts of caring, whether that be cleaning and bandaging a wound, taking someone to the emergency room, urgent care, or doctor's office for medical care, preparing and bringing a meal, running errands, or whatever it might be. Compassion is more than seeing. Compassion is responding to the need, and in so doing, caring for another. The author of Luke's gospel makes it clear that the priest, the Levite, and the Samaritan all saw the man in need. So there are no excuses, "But I didn't see him." They all responded, but not all responded with compassion. The priest and the Levite's response was to look the other way, putting themselves before the needs of the man. The response was to swerve just enough so that they would avoid stepping on him. Only the Samaritan responded with compassion. The Samaritan not only took care of the man's immediate needs, but he went the extra mile. It occurred to me as I read this very familiar passage that the Samaritan provided more than first aid to the injured man. Upon seeing the man in need, the Samaritan rushed to his side, cleansed and bandaged his wounds. I can't help but think of a storybook that our grandson Griffin has, and it tells the story of three animals who have been wounded. And what happens? Well, somebody cleans it, kisses it, and puts a Band-Aid on it, and it's all better. So he cleaned and bandaged the man's wounds, and he cleaned them with oil and wine. Seems like a peculiar mixture to us, but it was customary at the time, and I read somewhere that perhaps it served as disinfectant and also as soothing. I wonder if the Samaritan also tore his own garment. Where did he get the bandages? And wrapped the wounds with his own clothing. After giving the man first aid, the Samaritan transported the injured man and got a room for them, and he took care of him. So I would call this hospitalization. He was there to care for him during his hospitalization. And then the Samaritan went above and beyond. He provided for the man's care in his absence. And I would call this his rehabilitation until the man was back on his feet again. He said to the innkeeper, "Take care of him and I'll pay you whatever else you spend. If this isn't enough, I'll be sure that you get paid." Today's gospel story is what we refer to as the parable of the Good Samaritan. And it's interesting that the word good doesn't appear in it at all. So why do we call it this? Certainly, the Samaritan was good to the injured man. He responded in a decent, respectable, moral, and upright manner. So good fits. But I also wonder, might we call this the story of the compassionate Samaritan? To be compassionate is to be sympathetic, empathetic, feeling, concerned, kind. The Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. I don't know about that word so much. I think it's a poor translation. If we look it up in the Greek, it also means compassion. So I think a better translation would be that he was moved with compassion. So the Samaritan was both good and compassionate. There are two other occurrences of the word compassionate in Luke's gospel. The first being when Jesus saw the funeral procession of the widow of Nain's only son. When Jesus saw her, he had compassion for her. And what did he do? He didn't pass by. He didn't move aside. He raised her son from the dead. The other occurrence is in the parable of the prodigal son. When the son was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion and put his arms around him and kissed him. You see, showing compassion in Luke's gospel is connected with seeing, and it's a divine act. Well, I did an exercise with my colleagues this week at text study, so I'm going to do that with you this morning. I asked them, what other adjectives might we use to describe the Samaritan other than good and compassionate? What other adjectives might we use? Say them loud so I can hear them. Caring. Kind. Empathetic. Generous. Absolutely. Generous. Above and beyond. Yep. Patient. Okay. Well, I offered these to my colleagues. I said he was bold. He was brave. He was fearless, and some might call him even foolish. Because you see, the road they were on wasn't safe. It was notorious for robbers. It was rough terrain, providing places for robbers to hide and to pounce on their victims. To stop and help someone along the way, to slow down at all, was not in your best interest. But he did it. It was risky. My colleagues suggested the Samaritan was broad-minded. These are pastors, you know, so you have to keep that in mind. They said forward-thinking, generous, as you said. They said quick, reactive, and trusting. The Samaritan put the needs of the injured man before his own need for safety. We might also say that the Samaritan was selfless. The Samaritan was a good neighbor. So do we aspire to be like the Samaritan? And when have we done what the Samaritan did? And why have we helped? Was it because the person in need was a family member? Or a friend, a neighbor who lived next door or across the street? or in the same community, someone we knew, someone like us? And when have we passed by, like the priest and the Levite? When didn't we help? And why didn't we? Were we afraid? Was it inconvenience? Were we in a hurry to get somewhere? Was the person in need a stranger? And what was the color of his or her skin? Would it have made a difference if the priest or the Levite knew the injured man? Surely we think, well, then they would have stopped. The Samaritan saw the injured man as his neighbor. And he did as we heard in today's Old Testament reading and the Gospel reading, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And yet we know sometimes this is easier said than done. We can't do this by our own willpower or might. We can do it because we are first loved. We are filled with God's love, and God has shown us and continues to show us mercy. Could it be that the Good Samaritan in today's parable is Christ? Time and time again, Jesus embraces us with compassion. And here again, if we consider the Good Samaritan to be Christ, he sets an example for us of what it means to love, to show mercy, to respond with compassion, and to serve all people. Will you go and do likewise?